Here we are, and we're very pleased to see you. As you may have noticed, we are still one down. Will Hutton is not yet here. Those of you who know Will won't be entirely surprised. He is on his way. He says he's only a few minutes away. We shall see, but we'll give him a rousing welcome when he was going to introduce him. In fact, the most surprising thing I learned about Will when I was looking up his bio for the purposes of this evening was that he started life as a stockbroker. Did you know that? No, neither did I. But he is a political economist, author, academic, columnist, and all of those things, and heavily about the state of Britain. The most recent book is, hopefully entitled "No Mistakes This Time." And while we are waiting to welcome Will, we have our other speaker, who is Andrew, who is also a very, very political economist, also an author, and has just published this book, which unfortunately is not on the table at the back, but it is available in all good bookshops and on Amazon, and it is about the state of the nation. Again, the state of British politics, another subject about which Andrew has written extremely extensively. So what I suggest is that while we anticipate Will Hutton's arrival, we get going on the question of the election. And Andrew, I was saying I keep running into people who are politically engaged, interested in current affairs, and almost none of them are watching this election. They're not watching the debates. They're not really watching or listening to the speeches, to the manifestos. We seem to be from which people are really quite extraordinarily disengaged. Why do you think that is?
So I guess it's because it feels... So who's watched the leaders' debate so far? Has anyone watched any of them? One. Okay, so a bit of one. Okay, so I'll start with an admission. So having just finished a book, I'm in a zone where I am doing less. So I've not actually watched any of the leaders' debates, but there is kind of a reason for that, which is that my view on elections, and I've done this for the last couple, is that you can follow them too obsessively because you get caught up in the minutiae of what's happening. And therefore, if you kind of make a point of not deliberately going out of your way to find out what's happening, you only notice the really big things. So as far as I know, Rishi Sunak left D-Day events early. And some Conservative MPs have gambled on the date of the election.
Yeah, well, that did break through, I have to admit.
Those things have broken through. But let me give you a couple of other numbers on this one, if you bear with me whilst I switch back to my phone. So I'm going to draw a contrast with 1997, if that's okay.
Please do.
All right, so 1997, I was a young lecturer at the University of Exeter, and I was actually in the Labour Party at that point, and the candidate was Ben Bradshaw, who was fighting against an incumbent Conservative, and I went out on the doorsteps, and I was doing my bit, full of the vigour of optimistic youth. But looking back on it, Labour was so massively ahead in the opinion polls, rather like actors refusing to say the word Macbeth when they're in a theatre. Nobody I knew was prepared to say that Labour was going to get elected. There was this kind of complete reticence upon saying anything.
So even in private, they wouldn't say?
Even in private, it was like the taboo. It was
right.
Saying Macbeth. You would bring down the electoral gods upon you. And this time it feels just really different. I mean, everyone is saying it out loud, and the question seems to be, which is a really difficult one to answer, how large the majority is. So one answer is that this election looks like, certainly if you look at the Financial Times poll of polls, which tracks things, which is the one thing I do look at every day, it's absolutely not shifted at all. And even Reform, despite what you might think, is only up about 3% on where it started, which is not insignificant, necessarily the tsunami that you might expect. Here's the other one. This is where I'm going to come back to the numbers if you bear with me for a second. So, Here's some politics numbers for you. I'm going to give you 3 numbers, and lecturers who start off with numbers, kind of the lectures normally get really dull, but bear with me here. The numbers are 80, 45, 15. 80 is the proportion of people who, according to the most recent British Social Attitude Survey, think the British system of democracy could be improved by a great deal or improved a lot, and that's up from about 50% in the mid-70s. 15 people who either fairly strongly or very strongly identify with a party, that number having stood at around 45–50% in 1987. So just go for those 2 numbers because they give you the answer, which is that there is a lack of enthusiasm for any particular party, and that's potentially been a landslide election. So it's not the election of indifference, it feels to me. It's partly the election that has come to feel like a foregone conclusion, but it's also an election in which a sea change in politics, because that's what this election could be, is kind of passing almost unnoticed, it seems to me. So the interesting things, maybe, I mean, I could regret these words so much on the 4th of July, but it seems to me at this moment, the far more interesting thing is about what happens on the 5th of July than what happens on the 4th of July. And the way it plays out over that next month or 2 is going to tell us a great deal more than I suspect the campaign will.
I definitely want to get to what might happen on the 5th of July. But I also think that, you know, that figure you quoted of the very low number of people who identify with any political party, isn't that a new thing in Britain? What we seem to be picking up are people. I remember after the financial collapse in Argentina, it was, you know, what people were shouting on the streets was "que se vayan todos," you know, get rid of all of them. And there is a kind of bit of a sense of that the disillusionment with the Tories seems to have kind of disillusionment with politics. And you, maybe it's just the people who get sought out for vox pops, but a lot of people saying, I don't trust politicians, they promise things, they don't deliver. And given that Labour hasn't actually been in power for 14 years, it seems striking that they should be regarded in the same light as in terms of trust.
Yes. So, those of a certain age remember that 92 to 97 Parliament and sleaze, and the levels of trust fell. One of the interesting things that happened in 1997, trust tends to go in cycles. Overall, the curve goes, but 97 to 98, levels of trust in politicians, not just in Labour, but trust in politicians in general, rebounded back to the levels it had been in about the mid-1980s, which was not hugely high, but was certainly a lot higher than it had been in the dying days of the John Major administration. I'd be amazed if that happened this time, and that creates such a problem for Labour, because, of course, the flip side of it is that Blair had such an unbelievably positive environment that he inherited, both economically and in terms of the international environment. So that was someone with the world at his feet, charisma oozing out of, had the political capital to have done something far more radical, but didn't need to and didn't want to. This time round, he didn't think he needed to and didn't want to. This time round, you know, it looked so much more awful, so the demand upon an incoming administration to do more is much higher, but I just don't think that trust in politicians is going to be there. That's going to be a fundamental barrier. Labour's going to have to earn its trust as it goes through in that opening term. It's just not starting on that same level. So look at the numbers on the landslide. They may end up looking pretty similar, which would be a remarkable thing given what happened in 2019. But it feels to me, yeah, you're right, the trust is the key thing. So the willingness to give the government a benefit of doubt for a few years and wait to see what happens with the reforms that occur.
Which, given that, as you said, Labour is inheriting a very difficult situation, very different from 97, and that they don't have a charismatic leader and they don't have high levels of trust, that doesn't give them very long, does it?
No, it really doesn't give them. Difference from 97, those who were there will remember, it was taken as pretty much a foregone conclusion that that landslide in 97 would give you a second or a third term. Yeah. Blair didn't believe that. He was so cautious because he believed that even that scale of majority, but that once you've got that first term, you're going to get your second and your third. Absolutely, this time is not going to be the case.
It isn't. You're telling us it's not going to be the case, or that they're not going to believe it.
It is not the case that you can rest that a massive landslide this time will give you. That's Boris's inheritance to the world. With that volatile an electorate, so 45, that was my other number, of people, 45% of people in 2019 voted from a different party from the one they'd voted in the previous general election. Okay? 2017 and 19, I think this time round that percentage of people voting for a different party is going to comfortably top 50%. And those people, because they don't identify with a party, the ease with which you can then flip again in a couple of years' time, not least because you don't trust any politician, that's such a different 97. The electorate is fundamental. So even if you get the same result as you got then, it's going to look so different this time.
So that, I mean, that's a very kind of interesting proposition. I mean, I do think actually that Labour in the first term, after 90s, radical constitutional stuff, for example. You might argue that this time round there's a greater need for some radical constitutional stuff, but there isn't much of an appetite for it, I'm guessing. What do you think?
So that agenda for the incoming Labour, for the incoming government, is just going to be intense because it's the international environment, it's the domestic environment, it's constitutional, but it's also economic. So that challenge of getting growth going, which Will can talk to more when he gets here, given the rock bottom levels of investment and low productivity, that is just a challenge. You want to offer a really clear answer yet of how you can kickstart that one. And what you've got to suspect, if the underlying problem is low investment and low productivity, that to start to fix that problem is a decade-long political program, which is precisely what you don't have when you've got a volatile electorate. In the politics, in the economics, it's remarkable. 97, the economy in 97, the economy grew at 2.7% in that year. The boom had started in about 93, 94. It was a world boom. Growth rates slightly climb up under Labour, but that's the environment that you inherit, given that growth is effectively flatlining at the moment.
And Brexit?
Brexit's a bit of a challenge, to which the answer appears to be, don't talk about it, which is kind of the Jeremy Corbyn strategy in 2019, just it's not there. I'm actually a little bit more optimistic about what will happen with Brexit, and it's one way in which the international environment, which is in other ways so awful, is going to play into Labour's hand. So the whole securonomics agenda, which Rachel Reeves has been talking about, which he leads with the Mays, the renegotiation of those trade terms, we're not talking about going back into the European Union or a referendum, but the renegotiation of those terms, that will be presented as a security issue, not an economic issue. And it feels to me that that gives you a political imperative that you can do something. Europe, as I understand it, is waiting for that deal, because Europe's great fear was always that Brexit would be the first peg to fall and that other countries might follow.
But they looked at what happened.
That's not an issue at the moment anymore. So I think there's actually a deal there to be struck that is mutually, but will be particularly advantageous for Britain given how disadvantaged it's been. So that's one of the very few things that I think you could expect relatively smooth, quick progress. And because Britain will be in, and because Britain will still be out of the European Union, and you can dress it in the language of security, that seems to me a really different environment.
So just to go back to the constitutional issues, I mean, we appear to be looking at, and we could all be wrong, but on the 5th of July, we will wake up to a very different political landscape in the sense that, you know, the House of Commons will be very different. Rishi Sunak, the polls seem to be slated to be the first sitting Prime Minister who might lose his seat. So, could be radical. But that's, if you like, we've seen that before. We've seen changes of government. We've seen landslides. But there's also a sense, and I'm interested in whether you see this election as different in that sense. There's a sense that people no longer identify with the traditional parties as they did. They're very volatile. They shift allegiances. The traditional parties, which did represent particular interests, that's how they were born and grew, no longer really do. Those interests have changed. Working classes, shrunk almost to nothing. There is a whole question about why people would identify with these two large political parties. And at the same time, we have an electoral system which doesn't allow new entrants in any meaningful way. And we were, just before this began, that the last time that the British electorate got the government for which a majority of those people who actually voted was in 1922, and that was a coalition. Every government since then, more people have voted against it than for it, and that, may not be the best democratic model, but it's very hard to shift as long as we have first past the post. The Labour Party conference voted in favour of a constitutional reform, an electoral system. But traditionally, when governments get a big landslide, they tend to forget those promises because they think it's working for them. What are the chances, and how important do you think it is, given the state of disillusionment with democracy, with politics that we see not just in this country but elsewhere, that we really address what you get when you vote? What do you get if you vote Green or Lib Dem or even Reform? What do you get? Not much in the British system.
There's a lot there. Okay. Reform. Okay, so the way some of those numbers are shaping, it's not impossible to imagine that Reform gets a number of seats, which is a takeover of the Conservative Party by stealth. So I don't know if there's anyone here who's a Labour Party member, but steeped in that tradition of 1970s and 1980s British politics, anyone who was will remember fighting that battle for a 10, 15, 20-year period against left.
Yeah.
It might just turn out that the Conservatives can kind of do it in a space of months, because it seems to me that the activist base is already where Reform is, pretty much. That's an incredibly fragile situation. Okay, coalition. Blair toyed with it. So when you go back through some of the correspondence that's available, there was a point when Blair was interested in the very early days of his leadership of the Labour Party in having some kind of arrangement with the Liberal Democrats. And the talks got, I wouldn't say advanced, but they were meaningful. In the end, Blair walked away from them because he could walk away from them.
Yeah.
And he walked away from them because the Clause 4 debate, where he fought the Labour Party and won, settled for him what he saw as the key issue, which was whether Labour could be seen as a centrist party. When we're seen as a centrist party, I mean, that's the mark of a ruthless politician. The talks just stopped. The Liberal Democrats just sat there waiting for the phone to ring. And if you go back to Ashdown's diaries, he's quite explicit. Our position has been taken by Tony Blair. He has occupied the terrain that we were trying to fight on. Will it be different this time? It would certainly be a powerful signal in terms of realigning the left if you went into coalition. But I'd also be thinking, what was the experience of that last government? Plenty of opinion polls show that people want party. If you avoid the word coalition, that they want them to govern together. And the lesson of 2010 to 2015, certainly if you were the Liberal Democrats, is don't believe a word of that one, because given the choice, things can flip to the other direction. And I think we've got this heroic view of the great leader that will still come in and solve the country's problems. And because of that, there's a suspicion of that kind of cross-party talks, coalitions that we saw 2010 to 2015, because you can always be tarnished with the claim that you don't really believe in what you've said and you've traded away the promises that you made. I sense your optimism, but I don't see how that can, I'm not as convinced that that will have changed.
I wasn't particularly optimistic about coalitions. I don't know if you read Nick Clegg's post.
I did indeed. He was my MP for a while.
Yeah, so Nick Clegg, who, you know, at one point was the, though not of the majority party, but he wrote a book about the experience of being in coalition, in which he did point out that they're very bad for the smaller party, and not just in the UK, where we're not terribly sympathetic to coalitions, but that has tended to be true in European politics too, that you get, the smaller party tends to get blamed for all the unpopular things. But I wasn't, it was more the issue of electoral reform. I mean, surely at some point we have to look at the first past the post in a more kind of critical way. And perhaps if we're trying to remake politics.
Okay, so here's my alternative take on it, which is that the fundamental problem, and you've already identified it, is that people don't identify with political parties. I don't see that's going to change. So for me, and I'm not against electoral reform, I should hasten to add, but it feels slightly like it's a good answer to a different question, because it seems to me the more fundamental question now is, how do you operate a democracy in which that level of disenchantment with political parties is so intense? So if I was thinking of constitutional reform to see on the agenda for far more, is far more of a discussion about how you can operate a parliamentary democracy in which the stranglehold of the parties in terms of representation is weaker, that we find ways of having more independence and more cross-party cooperation. To that extent, you know, my gut feeling is that the parties cooperating at that elite level doesn't solve the problem, because if everyone hates parties, you just simply have two parties that you can hate. That the bigger question for how you can reinvigorate British democracy is to rethink more the role of political parties within that system.
Explain.
Okay, so the good example here from Australia is, you've come across the Teals? Anyway, I've lived in Australia for a long time, so it's kind of my secondary one. So going into the last election, you've now got a Labour government there. The keys in New South Wales and some Victoria, but particularly New South Wales, with a movement called the Teals, and it's because their colour of their party has become the colour of teal, so they're known as the Teals. There's not a cleverer reason than that. But what they were was an incredibly interesting, largely liberal, that's the equivalent of Conservative New South Wales, that weren't Labour, but were strongly pro-environment, often in more rural areas in New South Wales, where the climate change effects are happening in real time. And this bunch of independents got together in each of the constituencies, initially individually, effectively their own political party with a common banner, but run as independents, making it clear that they will operate with a level of discretion in how they act without a strong party structure. In other words, like, what's the foundation of the British political system? And when you do focus groups with people asking what they really don't like about politics, it's the idea that you can elect somebody who then has no discretion how they can vote. That seems to me an absolutely fundamental flaw, and is really central to understanding how parties are disliked so much. So it's not easy, but the Teal example in Australia seems to me to show something of a way forward, which you have looser collections of things that get called parties, but with far more discretion within them, where their individual representatives have more space to deliberate and work with different parties on particular issues, rather than forming formal coalitions at the top.
But they have to get elected in the first place.
And they did.
On first past the post.
It's a kind of, Australian system is a slightly weird one. It's got a proportional element within it, but it has first past the post elements as well. But what they did was effectively they offered a choice in Conservative constituencies in rural New South Wales, you care a great deal about the environment, but you're not happy with this mainstream party position because the strongly anti-green agenda. And by offering that space that had been previously unoccupied, they offered a different way of thinking about politics. Parties are so embedded in our system that's incredibly hard to imagine here. And our independents are elected. It happens occasionally, and we've seen it. But our parties are so embedded that it's hard to imagine that being scaled up. But it feels to me, politically in the 21st century, that's the bigger challenge. How do you manage a representative system in which we try and reduce that stranglehold that political parties currently have?
And welcome.
Sorry, trifle late, but I'm here. Thank you. Bloody hell.
Very good to see you, Will.
Yeah, well, glad to be here.
Would you like to...
Oh, I'd like some wine, actually.
Yeah.
An empty
It's
glass.
an empty
is not
glass,
there.
yes. So we've been, we've been chatting. The state of the nation, the state of the nation's politics, why, if this election feels different, and if so, why? And what will face the Labour government, which we rather assume is coming. So do you want to pick up there? Do you
Yeah. I mean, the starting off point has to be that there is a kind of a collective detestation, bordering on hatred actually, of conservatism and Toryism, and that's not come out of nowhere. You know, in my book, I talk about the 5 great catastrophes, starting with Mrs. Thatcher, actually, who I think was catastrophic. Monetarism, deindustrialization, Big Bang, failing to start a national wealth fund with North Sea oil, then the deregulation of the credit that led directly to the great crash, then austerity, then Brexit, then the Liz Truss budget. And the kind of massive under-provision of public services that, you only had to turn on Newsnight last night and listen to the various people telling their woes in the National Health Service. But it's in the prison system, it's in the court system, it's in the education system, it's in the military. I mean, and there's a tremendous sense that the country's been misgoverned, a tremendous sense of entitlement, which was partly Partygate. But the fact the campaign director of the Conservative Party headquarters has had to stand to one side because he was betting on the result of the election, on the date of the election. It's kind of symbolic plumbing of ethical standards. So I think one of the reasons why the election feels funny is that there is zero prospect of one of the principal parties vying for power of succeeding, and it's the barrel of a gun. I mean, evisceration. People say that's bad for British democracy because we need an effective opposition, and the Tories are trying to work that argument up. There's some truth in that for one parliament, but actually, for my money, the misgovernment between 2015, the kind of stupid way the referendum was launched, the lack of integrity, particularly by the Brexiters on making the case, and all that's followed, the turmoil, the number of prime ministers, the turnover. I mean, 12 housing ministers, 14 innovation ministers. I mean, it's incredible what kind of turnover. And it's a kind of lesson to kind of every incoming government that unless they govern level-headedly and well, there is a massive price to pay, a potential evisceration as a political party. And for my money, that's a really good message for democracy. It's really good that the Conservative Party kind of, could implode and face a long road back. And when they get in power again, because I'm sure they will one day, they will govern with much more in the last kind of period. That's the first point to make. The second point to make is that I think that there is one of the things that having an over-dominant right-wing press is that they want to kind of cast all politicians with the same kind of mantle of ineptitude and kind of moral turpitude as really true. And so there's a kind of a plague on all your houses kind of culture has grown up. But I'm going to try and lift your spirits because I'm quite optimistic about what Starmer may do. Well, let me just...
One mention of optimism and you get a glass of wine.
I'm really get going now. There's a bit of wine in me. I'm really quite optimistic what Starmer can do, and they'll take office. There'll be an interest rate cut in August, and actually the economy will kind of grow 1.5% in 2025. And as the Financial Times reported today, and as I made the argument as muscular and as forcibly as I could in my book, that actually borrowing for capital investment is a very different kettle of fish for borrowing for unfunded tax cuts. I mean, you can borrow 20-30 billion pounds, as the FT was suggesting this morning, and the bond markets will live with it if it's obvious that you're spending the money on, driving to net zero, levelling up, R&D, education, training, all the rest. Over and above that, there are two nascent institutions that the Tories launched and didn't really turbocharge sufficiently. One is the UK Infrastructure Bank, and one is the British Business Bank. And they've both got the capacity to lend with state guarantees, but off balance sheets. It doesn't count, it doesn't score as a budget deficit. Tens of billions of pounds. So I think that Rachel Reeves is going to exploit her capacity to borrow for public investment. She's going to turbocharge the UK Infrastructure Bank and the British Business Bank. And I think she's going to announce a comprehensive kind of review of council of the taxation of property, in particular council tax, and properly kind of organised. It needn't be so aggressive. And there's some tax yield to be got from that, along with some yield from fuel duties and some capital gains tax. You put all that in my view, within 3 years, the British economy will be the most vibrant in Europe. There'll be tangible improvement to public services, and there'll be a grudging recognition that actually it matters, and that Starmer will also be a principled guy. I mean, Churchill used to mock Attlee, saying Mr. Attlee is very modest, he's got a lot to be modest about, ha, ha, ha. And Clem Attlee himself did a little doggerel say, they all said that, what's the line? There were lots of people who, it ends up, lots of people thought they were smarter, but I'm the man who ended up being with the Order of the Garter. Was his own little doggerel for his funeral. I think Starmer's an Attlee figure, hugely underestimated, tremendous kind of moral centre, more than capable of running a government and running a government well. And he's got some really good people around him, and some of the quality of the incoming kind of MPs is really stunning. I mean, really fantastic young men and women. I worry about the geopolitical situation. I worry about, there's a powerful article, which I, in the New York Times yesterday, a column on, was it Friedman? On, how Israel could really face kind of war on 3 fronts and pull the United States into kind of nuclear conflagration in the Middle East. And I thought, shit, but you're much better on that than I am. But accepting that kind of disaster, or in Ukraine, I think Britain will, in 3 years' time, will be clearly on course to develop an economic and social model that is the others will want to copy. So lift your spirits. Don't be so glum. Smile.
Give the man a
Cheer. There's a fact change is going to happen.
Andrew, do you feel like cheering or responding or?
So I'm going to tell a story back from 97. So we spoke a little bit about the 97 election and the contrasts and the differences. So I'll tell a story which I don't know whether it's actually true, but which was on the night of the election, Blair flew from his constituency, took off from Newcastle and flew down to Stansted, where he was met and whisked away down the M11 and then into London. And the car pulls over into a lay-by and pauses. And the reason is so that when Blair will haul and says, we were elected as New Labour, we will govern as New Labour, a new dawn is breaking, literally a dawn was breaking. Right?
And it did.
And that 15 minutes matters for a lot, because you don't want to arrive in darkness. If you can, at the time, there is just that faint pink sky in the background. Okay, New Labour did govern as New Labour, and we talked about before how that second and third term, the electoral dynamics allowed it. This Labour government can't govern as New Labour. It has to be more radical because the economic situation is. I'm more pessimistic than Will on those political numbers and that electoral volatility and the lack of party identification. But I also share the view that Starmer is incredibly astute, ruthless, and can read, and the people he's bringing in, including most recently Torsten Bell, and kind of seems to me an incredibly serious government.
There's dozens of others of Torsten's stature. Dozens, literally dozens.
Yeah. So that's a very serious administration, and I think Starmer himself, you know, generally the view is so negative. He's just a degree of backstory, sincerity, which comes across often as that awkwardness. Okay, that's your opposite to Blair, because that kind of incredible oozing political charisma that fades over time. I actually think Starmer is a more substantive politician in many ways, and I think they will have to look at that inheritance and do a lot. They'll just have to do it very quickly, Will.
We were talking, Will, before you arrived about one of the differences between now and 1997 is that there isn't a sense that Labour has a lot of time to prove itself, that the level of disillusionment in the country with politics is such that it's going to be quite challenging for people to have faith and for Labour to keep that faith, given that it isn't going to be entirely easy, despite your wonderfully optimistic picture.
Well, I mean, I think that he believes in mission-driven government. In Sue Gray, he has an ex-senior official who has got a good idea how to make that work. In Ed Miliband, he has a Secretary of State who's got a clear agenda on the drive to net zero and how to do it and what levers to pull to make that happen. Yeah. Rachel knows that if she, there is building it up from year 1, year 2, but by year 3, year 4, the kind of run rate of public investment should be between 40 to 50 billion pounds higher than it would have been under the Tories. And she needs to do that to get the growth, and she needs to do that to assuage her own party, and she needs to do that to hold a job down. If Keir starts to think that Rachel has been captured by Treasury orthodoxy and is kind of, Jeremy Hunt light, he'll sack her.
Okay,
he's ruthless in that sense, and so she has to mind a bit. I like Wes Streeting. I think he's going to be good at health. I think the cross-cutting notion of mission-driven government's smart. There'll be false turnings and things. I'm sure of it. But I also think, and here really I think tremendously important, and which again under talked about. I co-chair a kind of liberal business think tank called the Purposeful Company, and we try and promote the notion that companies should put purpose before profit. And we when we started, were other kind of men and women shouting from the edges. But, you know, more and more big companies and medium-sized companies are signing up to support us. And, you know, the kinds of things I argue about in my columns and my books that were seen as kind of far out or leftist do are now seen as kind of stuff they want to do. I mean, I can introduce you to chief executives and chairs of some of the top companies in the country who are kind of willing this growth agenda forward and want to make it happen and dissociate themselves completely with the conservative extent. That billionaire kind of said what he said the other day. And there's lots of them who think the same way. I also know the kind of tech world a bit. I've yet to come across the founder of any high growth tech company in the UK that's mustard, who would call him or her, they just wouldn't go near it. They are socially liberal, progressive, you know, come down like a ton of bricks on kind of sexual harassment at work and all of that. You know, really believe in inclusion and believe in kind of behaving as stakeholders or trading off their stakeholder and really get the kinds of things that I've talked about. Julia Hoggart, who's the chief executive of the London Stock Exchange, you know, to my amazement, you know, because when I wrote this in the state we're in 25 years ago, saying, you know, the city of London has got to stop kind of being so short term. It's got to that. It must make money kind of anywhere but investing in the UK. It must look at its hinterland. There needs to be a domestic bias in the way, you know, bloody hell, she stands up and says that kind of thing. So I kind of, you know, the British business community is looking for a lead from a well-intentioned government to set about wealth generation, which actually spreads across the country. And it's a wonderful, incredible moment in time.
Okay. So can I have two...
Sorry, I'm being very optimistic.
It's allowed. I have two more questions, then I really want to open it up. So for either or both of you, so what happens to the Tory party from, you know, July 5th onwards, assuming, you know, taking into account Farage, and what happens to this great perspective if Trump is elected in November? And we're looking at turbocharging again right-wing populism, not just in the United States, but across Europe. And Britain, how untethered can we be from a Trump agenda, a very dangerous... What happens then to these best laid plans?
Do you want me to answer that?
Either of both, please.
Shall I go first? You want to go first? I've been talking a lot.
Well,
okay, well, right, okay. Well, the Tory party and then Trump. First of all, kind of little story, and then cut to the chase. My mother was one of four sisters in a kind of well-to-do farming family in Oxfordshire, and sisters didn't marry, and two of them lived in this grand house in Bletchington. And one of the things they would do is to secure their social status was to open their garden to the public for some days every year, but also to every month hold the Conservative Party kind of meeting in their house. And it was part of their social standing that they were Tories, and it was part of their social standing, and it was understood that, you know, Toffs, Toryism, the Marquee, Gardens to the Public were all part of a seamless kind of web, and proof positive that you were English and a stout. You go to Bletchington now, or Woodstock, where I kind of, where I have a kind of, there's a family house which I still keep going. It's Labour, Lib Dem. The Tories have finished, completely finished in that part of Chipping Norton, and has a kind of, and actually, what's happened amazingly in our lifetimes, Isabel, is that actually the more, if you're educated, if you're well off, if you've got a degree, if you're a professional, kind of and other Tories at the Hunt or in the Marquee is no longer a kind of a signifier of social status. And actually, Mrs. Thatcher threw all that away. And that's one of the things. And people like Liz Truss and even Boris Johnson, who kind of accepted this inheritance and thought that Toryism was their natural kind of, to be Tory was, and to go to one of the great schools and one of the great universities, that actually these institutions were indissolubly linked with being English and being Tory. The whole thing was of a piece. That has absolutely gone. And recovering it may never happen. And actually, there's a great book to be written on how it was thrown away and who threw it away and why they threw it away. The free marketeers were part of the story. I mean, I think the Wets were right, actually, back in the early 80s, that actually the post-war settlement needed reforming, not scrapping. But the disdain with which the Thatcherites held those Wets, people like Jim Pryor, Ken Clarke, great men, actually. And the natural thing to do was to kind of, leaving university, go like Chris Patten did to join the... Chris Patten would now tell you he would never, ever, ever... I mean, Chris Patten, who joined the Tory Research Department in the early 60s, you know, I mean, he wouldn't go near the contemporary Tory party. I kind of think there's a... I mean, it's not just about trying to coalesce around a kind of a program for government and a policy program. It's also about, you know, what are the kind of other signifiers that actually make people proud to be a Tory, that actually helps the party kind of coalesce and they've gone. And interestingly, the people who it's falling to are the kind of, you know, vice chancellors of universities or the heads of hospitals or the people who fast high-tech companies, all of them in Starmer's coalition. Right. So I think the Tories are, to coin a phrase, fucked for quite a long time. And, you know, and
populism and Trump.
Well, I don't think Trump's my basic. I'm not sure I accept the premise. I mean, Biden and Trump are now level pegging in the polls. Trump looks frail. Biden looks frail and forgetful and falls asleep. But I mean, gosh, I mean, Trump kind of is no less forgetful. And when push comes to shove, I don't think the swing voters in swing states are going to vote for a felon. So I'm quite optimistic that the scenario won't happen. But here's the point. If it were to happen, you know, what's a safe haven currency? It's a community. You know, where are you going to kind of build your semiconductor factory? You know, where do you want to develop your AI capacity? I mean, your eyes will turn to London and the southeast of England, and actually, you know, I mean, actually, it's not, you know, you know, Britain was so near to being a fantastic country that's attractive to kind of live in and operate in, and it's been messed up by 14 years of conservatism. But we're still the world's second largest exporter of services. We still are only just in China in the number of unicorns that we've generated over the last kind of 5 years.
We don't keep them, though.
They all go back to the United States. Yeah. Some of the things that I tell Rachel Reeves and Keir is that actually, if they want to be wealth creators, kind of talk about how pleased they'll be when the stock market doubles. Along to the stock exchange's growth plan conference on July the 10th, when they're going to float ideas to do just that. And I expect to be jostling with lots of Labour spads, kind of taking back the message to Downing Street and the Treasury. I mean, it's in our, you know, we could be we're so near to being a fantastic country. Okay. And it's kind of, and it could happen. You could all live to witness it, you know.
I'm just going to add 20 seconds. I don't want to be typecast as I'm too young to be this pessimistic. But I find Will's analysis there remarkable and incredibly reassuring. Here's the date that worries me, though, which is just a few days after the general election. I think it's the 7th. I think it's only 3 days after.
Paris.
Paris, yes.
Okay, so what happens if an essentially fascist party running on anti-immigration wins, and what are the repercussions of that on debates around immigration and the relationship between immigration and growth in the UK? That seems to me to potentially set a dynamic in an international arena that I would be more worried about. Trump, possibly, I'm a bit more sanguine, but that immediate relationship and the proximity of France is going to create a dynamic at the moment that the Conservative Party is already splintering in 1,000 different directions.
I think we also perhaps have underplayed, if I might suggest, the negative potential politics on British politics. There are any number of situations which are highly volatile and dangerous and could certainly kind of impact, but you know, we can't predict those. You've been very patient. Yeah, there is a microphone.
Thank you. I was interested in your last point regarding the 7th. Oh, sorry.
If you just speak into you, if you talk into it like that.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Yes, I was interested in your point about the 7th of July. Of course, it might not necessarily mean that the RN candidate becomes Prime Minister. Perhaps there's going to be, in effect, a hung parliament in France. Combine that with a very weak Scholz in Germany, who leads Europe. Maloney, and where does that leave a new Labour Prime Minister on the 8th of in the months going forward?
In a fantastically strong position. That's another of the kind of, you know, Napoleon said, give me lucky generals, give me lucky politicians. I mean, how fabulously lucky is that? We want to get closer to Europe, need to get closer to Europe. I mean, the tiptoeing kind of baby steps that have been proposed by kind of Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer are kind of wholly inadequate. You know, we need to do some kind of suddenly, you know, Britain becomes a kind of point of stability. We actually were first into this populist nightmare with Brexit. It's been a total cock-up. You know, I mean, there's been I mean, very few people will fess up to being Brexiters, and even Brexiters saying, you know, they wouldn't vote Leave again. And so, you know, having kind of fallen prey to populist temptations and seen how it works out, we've elected a kind of a Labour government which looks set fair for 5 years, and as the Tories, you know, fall apart in the way I've described, probably follow through. That's not, can't be certain of that, of course. And so, you know, suddenly, you know, if you're the kind of European French just want to kind of course you want a security deal with Britain. You might even want to create a European political community with Britain, a European environmental community with Britain. You know, you want to be kind of, you want to be accommodative. You know, this country can maybe anchor a bit of European stability in all these terrible fluctuations and cross currents. Maybe there are politicians in France and Germany who want to emulate what Starmer has done. You know, I think it's kind of again, you know, I'm much better that if you want to cut deals with Europe, which we need to do, than actually have a situation where kind of Europe's set fair and hasn't got any issues, and they can regard us as a third currency and they can ignore us. I mean, they won't be able to ignore, you know, what Starmer has done and what Starmer is achieving. And there'll be a lot of people wanting to reproduce it in Europe, want to transfer the model. So I think it's kind of a fantastic opportunity for us. You know, I mean, we were, you know, if I could live my life again, I wouldn't want to, obviously, us to leave the European Union. I mean, I thought it was a disaster. But actually, some benefits of it are precisely the opposite to the ones that people like Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg ever thought they would be. They're actually going to draw us closer to Europe, kind of create a much more pro-European population, and give scope for some bespoke deals that work for both sides, remodeling a relationship with Europe that's actually quite interesting, I think. So I can't, you know. So I'm being sorry. You know, that I know is what Nick Thomas Simmons thinks. and he's quite wired into, he's going to be the person in charge of kind of Europe and the kind of agreement and that's what he thinks, and I think he's right.
Andrew, do you want to? No? Okay.
No, we got. The thing is that there's a kind of, I don't know how to kind of. It's partly social media. It's partly our national culture. But we've all become so kind of downbeat and down in the mouth and skeptic and kind of we're completely fucked and there's nowhere to go and the country's gone to hell in a handbasket and all politicians are shit and actually, some of the kind of upsides in the current situation never discussed.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my point was that all politicians are shit doesn't apply to us, it applies to what's happening in Europe. And that's where I find it difficult to conclude. I think you're being very optimistic. I hope you're right.
Well, look, I am being optimistic. But there's two huge things. One, Maloney is no longer a fascist. She herself says, there's no votes on the extreme right. It's the centre right. That's what I like. Two, Italy, France have dropped any notion of leaving the European Union or the euro. And even in the AfD, that split between the kind of extremists who want Germany to leave the euro and actually the mainstream AfD people who say we've got to stick in it. I thought the results of the European elections were rather good, actually. I thought the centre held.
Wait, but another question at the back there.
Sorry to interrupt. That is
Not at all.
a great discussion, though. I was excited to hear about the prospect of more spending. How do you see Rachel Reeves getting round the short-termism of fiscal rules? This is directed at Will, I suppose. Or both.
She's given us the answer in a sense, which is that the May's lecture kind of foreshadows a sharp distinction that New Labour toyed with but never really saw through, which is the distinction between long-term borrowing and day-to-day expenditure. That is ripe fruit waiting to be plucked. That's an area where
Sorry, can I follow up then? Does that imply then a different style of fiscal rule? Do we see them as reshaping how we define fiscal responsibility then? Because at the moment it's still
I'll say one more word and then hand over to Will. So the OBR is ultimately lost track of the number of times that its rules have been changed. It's been a very effective body in some respects. I think it's really important, but there is more wriggle room there than you might think. The Bank of England, that's a tougher relationship, Will.
If you talk to any senior Treasury official, actually, the fiscal rules. There were 3 substantive rules that she plans to adhere to. One is the distinction that's just been made. Secondly, is that she wants the OBR to assess a net worth. That's to say, she wants them to assess the value of the additions she's making to the UK's capital stock against the liabilities in debt to produce a net figure. Now, as you probably know, under the Tories, that figure has gone red than any other country in the OECD except Portugal. And rebuilding that so it's become positive is a kind of big task and is going to require the kinds of public investment levels I talked about. She wants also to make sure that the Office of Budget Responsibility ensures that kind of when you undertake a public investment, it has a kind of positive net return, which is, I think, completely fair enough. And lastly, she wants public debt in year 5 of the planning cycle to fall as a share of GDP. But the OBR are obliged to use the Treasury producers when it makes that calculation. So in about 45 minutes, 2 or 3 guys, usually guys, actually nerds, kind of playing around with a computer program, just come up with the numbers that need to demonstrate that the debt in year 5 is falling. So, this is what she's invented for herself is the language of rectitude, but the capacity to do public investment on a remarkable scale, supplemented with the sovereign infrastructure guarantee that the UK Infrastructure Bank can use, and a parallel guarantee that the British Business Bank can use, where we're going to, for the first time, really kind of become serious about investing in ourselves as a national community. It's fantastic. And there'll be the walk, it won't happen in quite the way I want, but the direction of travel is the way I want to described.
Just finally on that one, I'd agree with all of that, but the overall level of debt and the debt interest payments, now they might come
That's
down,
true.
They may well come down, but at the moment, given that we're spending more on debt repayment than we are on education, that's appear. I entirely agree with the wriggle room that's there, and you start with what you've got and you build from it, but that inheritance is still there, and that would probably worry me a little bit.
And what does that mean? The things that people complain about, which is the lack of money in the NHS, the lack of money in education, the lack of money in the kind of social delivery. How does that help?
Well, I mean, I just think that, I mean, it's going to be a long, I mean, putting together 14 years of neglect is kind of not done, and here Start was right. It's not, you can't put that right in 1 year or 2 years. But actually, I'm struck that, the woman in the street is kind of, I mean, she knows which way is up, and people, I mean, if the British electorate, if they see the trends moving in the right direction, we'll give a big tick. Obviously, there'll still be people in corridors in A&E departments in 3 years' time, but much less than now. There'll be much more capacity to see a GP when you choose. Actually, I can see my GP within 48 hours, actually, where I live. It's amazing. It can be done. And that could be genuine. I think this, I mean, one thing is, if I have one worry, it's that I do think the roots of inequality in Britain are very deep. Wealth inequality, hoarding of opportunity, educational inequality, kind of digital inequality, regional and spatial inequality are phenomenally deep-rooted, and actually making progress on that's going to be really tough.
There was a question at the back there.
Yeah, so that's a perfect segue into my question, which is, I think that you're going to be able to get a durable political support for the net zero transition that we're going to need unless you simulate inequality and make people feel that they are benefiting and being taken along. And I think the evidence so far suggests that the net zero transition is being grafted onto the pre-existing economic order. It's capital intensive, it benefits IP, it benefits climate tech startups, but it's not going to reorder our economics. And the idea that reinvent its capacity to build wind turbines and compete against the Germans or the Danes or the Chinese or the Americans is, I think, whimsical. So if we're trying to get a two-term Labour government that's committed to net zero, people to buy into it, where are we going to find the policies that reorder inequality and get us to net zero at the same time?
I think you should go first.
So there's a guy called Matthew Lawrence at the think tank called Commonwealth, and he was kind of showing me some data the other week. Britain has comparative advantage in some areas. Are we going to take China over when it comes to constructing the turbines? No. But there's actually areas where, and it surprised me to look down through the numbers, where it's certain bits of the supply chains for green technology, and there's particular centres in Scotland as well as the southeast of England. Britain has elements of comparative advantage that are there to be built in, and I actually think that the potential with investment money going in is not negligible. It is a huge challenge, but you can only go from where you start, okay? And from that level, our Will's kind of, I've been reading Will's stuff for so long. I started with a more pessimistic outlook, but this new Will is kind of like, I'm feeling incredibly energized by it. On board.
Got to read the new book.
You can only you start where you are, and I actually think that Britain has more of a industrial capacity, industrial defined broadly, certainly not traditional sense as always, but there is perhaps more capacity there than you might think. And it also seems to me, if you're very clever, combine that with a substantive and real levelling up agenda. So there is a window there where you can get those different things at the same time. But I come back to the politics. You know, this is not a landslide that gives you a second term with anything like the degree of assurance of 97.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's a substantial overlap between the kind of net zero and levelling up agenda, actually, and a really important dimension of inequality is regional and spatial. I mean, I echo Joe Biden actually when he says, you know, when I hear the word green, I hear the word jobs. I mean, there's a substantial scope for reindustrializing kind of, you know, the northeast, the East Midlands, parts of East Anglia, with, you know, the green revolution, and actually organizing it so that, you know, a bunch of towns around. I mean, it's already happening in Lincoln, you know, where Siemens has got a huge plant serving the North Sea, kind of, and you know, they built a whole, you know, the university there is kind of supplying trained folk for Siemens in Lincoln, and that, you know, that could happen. It could happen in further north. I was on the board of the satellite applications catapult for 9 years. There are 9 or 10 catapults. They're quite small scale, actually, about 150, 200 people, but they're meant to kind of, you know, catalyze, with catapult, they're meant to catalyze kind of adjacent technologies to make another technology that catalyze ups into scale-ups, kind of catalyze big multinationals into developing supply chains in the UK. They're quite successful, actually. And you know, the space catapult that I was on was very successful, I think. And there's, you know, there's a kind of space cluster in Glasgow. There's a space cluster around Durham, another one around Leicester, which are really quite, kind of, in European terms, quite vigorous. You know, so I kind of, again, I'm going to, you know, you're going to think what Will's been smoking, actually, you know, kind of, he needs to lie down in a darkened room and get real. But I mean, Isabel's point is perhaps most pertinent. You know, there's 30 companies in the last 15 years that would have been in the FTSE 100, or they're all high tech, that have either been taken over by private equity or by American and Japanese nationals, and they've exited our shores. But they would have been, we could have had, instead of having only one high-tech company in the FTSE 100, we could have had 30 or 40. Our capacity to kind of build these kind of companies is really extraordinary. And the ecosystem that's surrounding it needs to be kind of matured. And more of this effort needs to stay in our island. And that requires a much more buoyant stock market with valuations for than they currently are. But all that can be done. So I'm kind of thinking, in answer to your question, I think that you can do quite a lot about levelling up, because quite a lot of these unicorns are spread around the country, actually. They're not only in London and the southeast. And quite a lot of the startups are, again, outside London and the southeast. You know, a smart industrial policy, repurposing the financial system, getting these companies to stick and not leave our shores, getting some agglomeration, kind of building on the Lincoln effect in kind of Leeds, Bradford, kind of, and all these towns. You know, you can make some significant steps in the next 5 years and follow through in the 5 years that follow.
10 seconds Andrew, just to come in as well, Hill. If housing is the other one. Insulation and hub. That's the other source of the potential answer.
You ended on a Topic dear to my heart, Andrew, thank you. I hope,
Drafty house in North London.
ladies and gentlemen, that you felt that that was that rare thing in an electoral campaign, a discussion on the election that brought more light than heat. Will's book is at the back. Andrew's book is available in all good bookshops and on Amazon. Please join me in thanking them both for a really terrific discussion.